I once worked as a seasonal ranger for a local forest district in Oregon. Back in summer of 2016, I just decided to give the program a shot for the first time. Being a very outdoorsy person, it sounded like an exciting way to make easy money. The first 3 weeks, everything was normal, and overall, I was having a great time. The work was more demanding than I'd expected, but nothing I couldn't really handle. By the 4th week, I had already considered myself an expert in all ranger responsibilities. Oh, the naivety. Monday of my first week, I'm out on a daily patrol on a trail that I'd never gone around before. The trail ran along a small stream, a very tranquil spot. So, I just began walking around, enjoying the scenery, treating it more like a recreational hike than an actual patrol. My daydreaming was abruptly cut when I almost tripped over a dead deer. After examining it closely and confirmed that in fact it had no pulse, I felt incredibly dumb right after. I noticed the animal had no eyes. I called my superiors. They came to examine it, telling me to step away from the corpse, as it might be diseased. I was told later, the deer showed no signs of disease, so they'd just taken it out of the trail, dumping it deep in the forest. I was dumbfounded. I asked if they even knew what it died from. They told me they don't perform complete autopsies on dead deers. Apparently, I was making a bigger deal than what it actually was. I asked about the eyes, and they didn't really have any explanation for it. They claimed an animal probably ate it. It didn't really make sense that they'd leave the rest of the corpse intact. They didn't really care much about it. But it didn't leave my head. I decided to try and let it be, figuring this would just be a one-time incident. Next day, once again, a daily patrol on the same path to report any other strange sightings or any other animals, to assess any possible dangers. After being a bit reluctant, but I agreed, I head up the trail, nervous about not really knowing what I might find. I get there. Everything seems fine. I relax a little and begin walking with more ease when I find them. 2 deer this time, further away on the trail than yesterday, lying on the floor, dead. I begin to have a bad feeling about the situation. Once again, I reported my findings, and they dismissed me, checking out the other animals. Once again, they found no diseases, but having 3 dead deer in a span of only 2 days did prompt a more in-depth search. These deer were also examined for their causes of death, and this is where it starts to become really unsettling. You see, both deer were perfectly healthy. There were no signs of any organ failure or any disease. The only thing missing, again, were their eyes. They had to label their cause of death as unexpected cardiac arrest, which can happen, but to 3 healthy deer consecutively, all in the same area, seemed like a stretch. We all agreed that the situation was strange. The park could not continue letting these deer die off like this. So, a night patrol was instated in that area. Their job was to determine if this was simply being provoked by an animal, or, I don't know, something, or someone. Next day, I came to work, was greeted with the news that the night patrol assigned for the region had nothing to report. Everything had been quiet, till suddenly, some yards away, white lights began flashing incessantly from the middle of the forest. They quickly got there and found nothing more than a couple of dead foxes, both perfectly healthy, their eyeballs missing. I was starting to get really scared about the situation, and my boss had told me this might be a case of cult activity taking place. It had been an issue prior to this. She informed me not to worry. If I found something suspicious, to get out of there immediately and report it to any of my superiors. The police would handle it from then on out. Next day that I was on patrol, I was trying my best not to be a total walking nervous wreck, walking as if half expecting somebody or something to jump out at me from behind a tree. I walked through the trail, looking around everywhere. At first, I found nothing, but decided not to let my guard down. Good decision, since a few feet away, I found something I don't think will ever leave my head. I found no carcass this time, but instead, a simple white bowl, just placed in the middle of the trail with a fork inside of it. I didn't recognize it from far away, but once I got closer, I began to get weary. It sounds dumb, I know, but after the events of the week, just finding a bowl right in the middle of the trail cannot be good. I approached the bowl as if it were going to jump at my face at any moment. Once I finally got there, I looked inside. These whitish, slimy spheres were filling them up. I instantly knew what they were. A small cardboard card laid on top of them, with very neat handwriting. It said this in almost perfect cursive: "Feast upon the eyes of the fallen, and aspire to gain their insight, for they have gazed upon the truth and perished." I dropped the bowl and ran, completely unwilling to deal with whatever that may be. Others were sent to examine the letter and retrieve the bowl. Police were called, and turns out the eyeballs were not only animal, but indeed one of them had actually belonged to a camper who'd gone missing about 8 months prior. His remains were never found. The incidents stopped that day. We never ran into any more eyeless carcasses anymore, nor say any strange lights. I found the whole situation incredibly disturbing, not only because of what had happened, but also due to how fast everybody had just forgotten about it, carried on with their jobs. That's when one of the superiors had informed me, I think summarizes the forest ranger experience. Sometimes you'll find things you'll just never be able to explain, and the best you can do is to try and learn to live with it. After my contract was over, I never signed for the job again. I'm not much of a fan for forest, not anymore. I was a Navy pilot for 10 years, and I saw some pretty crazy things. From the time I spent in the air to my time on land, it had been an amazing journey. In my time serving the military, there was a short period of time that I helped assist search and rescue before fully pledging myself to the Navy. I was in my office when the call came through. I remember it like it was yesterday. I had been with the Navy for 3 years at this point, but it wasn't until I realized just how much I loved search and rescue. It's one of those jobs where you never know what to expect, or who will be on the other end of the line when you pick up your phone. I remember feeling a rush of adrenaline as soon as they had asked me for help. This would be my first time participating in a search and rescue mission. The caller had explained that there were 2 peoples stuck up in the wilderness who needed help, requiring my skills among several other of my peers to help find them. It seemed like a pretty routine mission. People get lost in the woods all the time, after all, and usually, we're not able to help find them. However, this time was different. It was a sunny day as well, not a single cloud in the sky. Perfect weather for flying around and looking. I took off of work early that day. I knew it was going to be a long search, but I could not wait to finally use the training. As our blades began spinning, my mind began wondering, what could have happened? Who's stuck up here? These poor people. Why weren't they prepared outside if the weather forecast told them it would not work? Well, the 2 people were found, but unfortunately, it was too late. They had been dead for roughly 48 hours at this point. The only thing I could do was take their remains back and report the incident. It's always hard to come home after a mission like this. You know there's nobody who could help those poor souls. Not anymore. Many events like these do often end in tragedy, but it's the way about the past that has made me deeply disturbed. These bodies, they were found completely beheaded. Not by a blade, but their heads were torn from their bodies, and their bodies had remained completely untouched, unharmed. Not a scratch on them, no broken bone. It's as if simply their bodies had just fallen. We never found their heads. I'm glad I wasn't the only one who thought this was strange. It makes me think there might be something out there that nobody wants to get anywhere near. We were able to track down 2 missing people, but their heads were gone. The police took care of the bodies, and they looked. They did not find anything. No weapon, no signs of foul play. No reason why these 2 should be completely beheaded. They said that these people could have been killed by a wild animal, or maybe they had gotten into a fight with someone before they had died. There was nothing that made sense in the way their bodies looked, and the way in which they died. Even the dogs seemed scared when we tried to track down traces, like they knew something bad was around. This was my first time ever participating in a search and rescue, and it turned out to be one of my most memorable. It wasn't exactly normal. My team and I had found 2 dead people who had been completely beheaded in the strangest of ways. Police had wrote it down as a bear attack, but come on, we all know this was not a bear. It's hard to explain, but when we found the 2 people and their heads had been torn off their body, I'm not saying a bear couldn't do something like this, especially I guess if they're hungry, but generally, bears kill differently. There would be obvious signs, there would be tracks. There's no way a bear could hold down a person, rip off their head, without doing any other sort of damage or nibbling on the body. Like, the bodies again were preserved. No tracks, no claw marks, no nothing. It just doesn't add up. The manner in which they died or their bodies were dumped does not make any sense. Not to mention, when I was there assisting, I could have sworn that I saw a strange light coming from the north, off in the trees. I'd asked a couple of my teammates if they had seen it too, but they shrugged at me and laughed, claiming I'd not gotten enough sleep. Look, I'm not going to deny that strange things happen in this world, because sometimes you encounter things and go through things that don't really make a lot of sense. But there's nothing worse than being reminded that you are helpless and you cannot do anything about it. This memory still creeps me out and is easily the most disturbing find we've ever found. For a little info on me, I've been in the Forest Ranger Service for about 6 years now, and I spend most of my time in the forest, studying wildlife. I was finishing up my night shift, and I had 1 more hour before I could go home and sleep. It's a very quiet and dark place. Most of the time, all you see around you is wildlife, depending on where exactly you work. I was about to leave when I just didn't feel right. I can explain it in only 1 word. Fear. Something was telling me to turn back and go home, but I couldn't do that. So I turned on my headlight and began walking into the forest in search of whatever it was that's there with me. Something was drawing me to it, like luring me into the night. I walked in silence for about 10 minutes, feeling very drawn to something, and that's when I heard a very strange sound. It sounded like a very deep, distorted growl or hum, coming from something large, presumably. Probably like a moose. I turned my headlight on and kept walking towards the sound. Now, with both my flashlight and headlight on, I felt like I would have enough light to see whatever was the reason behind this noise. It kept getting louder and louder until it eventually became so unbearable, I just had to turn my extra light on, my belt LED light. That's when I saw it, standing there, right by the tree. This translucent, glowing human shape. I felt like I shouldn't be scared, but I felt like I was face to face with something out of this world. Something from another dimension. I froze in place for a second or two, and then it seemed to kind of just disappear. I was so frightened by what I saw, I turned and ran. And once I'd got away, I immediately called up my boss and told him what had happened. He got really quiet over the phone, but I assume he believed me, because he started telling me why on earth would I follow that noise, almost as if he himself knew exactly what it was. And here I was, on the verge of what seemed like a mental breakdown, having just encountered a flipping alien or something, or some sort of interdimensional entity. The next few days after, I hardly slept, and I felt like a nervous wreck. I had about 3 times my normal cup of coffee just to try and function. Fortunately for me, I got a chance to speak with one of my friends who's also one of my colleagues. We don't work together very often, but when we do, he's a very open and honest guy, and allowed me to relate to him what my experience was like. I didn't fear he would mock me or disbelieve me. He just heard what I had to say and gave his 2 cents on the whole situation. Told me that it's not something he really enjoys talking about, but there have been reports of people seeing strange lights in the sky and other weird alien-like things in the forest. Something that, before this sighting, if I had heard that, I would have totally blown that off, as people are delusional and like to make things up. But this, accompanied with this experience, seems far too uncanny, to be honest. So, I'll leave it up to you. I want your opinion on what you think I saw. I'm 25 years old, female, and I've been working in the Forest Service for a couple of years now. I love it with all my soul. I would not change the freedom that comes with the wilderness for nothing. Close to the end of winter season, I was assigned to accompany 2 colleagues of mine. They were doing some trail clearing and to check on the state of paths, while I'd switch between helping them and surveying the surrounding areas. The park was to be open for tourists and hikers. This was also after the quarantine and the administrative entity that deals with national parks and wildlife in our area. We had wanted it to be ready for visitors. So, we go on, deeper and deeper into the woods with each day. And we spend the days working and the nights chatting, listening to music and talking by radio to the central station and the park ranger teams closest to us. We were rather excited about going out and meeting one another after the coronavirus mess, especially because, while there were some emergency groups left to look after the park, this time, the place was going to open up for months of inactivity. It was in 2020. Everything was surprising. I remember, one night, we were inside the tents. We had 2 tents, one for me and my colleague, we'll call her Vanessa, and another for Darren, the oldest of us. It was late at night, and I awoke feeling rather tense. Do you know that feeling that comes before something happening? Like your body is preparing your head to pay attention to your surroundings. I can't explain it. It was some instinct. And I hear a woman yelling out of the tent, in the middle of nowhere. Then I heard it again, close. I saw nothing, and nothing else happened that night. The woods sometimes make freaky sounds, so I ignored it. There's no way I'd wake up my colleagues. Next day, we wake up and find weird scratch marks in the trees, around 5 to 8 meters from our tent. Bill looked at the marks and asked if we had heard anything by night. Vanessa hadn't, and they told me to speak because it was just showing up in my face. So I told them about the woman low crying, and we all agreed it had to have been a fox. They make those sounds, and there are many stories about people out in the woods hearing a woman crying, finding out foxes making those noises. We kept on with our routine. That night, I wake up again and hear a woman crying, yelling. It was distorted, but I tried to ignore it. This time, though, it was closer, and Vanessa moved in by my side. She woke up all groggily, asked what was going on. The noise stops outside, and I swear it hurt us. The next morning, we find those weird scratches by the trees close to us. But this time, the pictures had something close to a pattern, like crosses and that stuff. Even Bill was surprised and told us to keep going. There was this tacit silence, like we consciously did not speak aloud, but to make sure whatever it is out there wouldn't hear us. The third night, I wake up again and hear the woman's cries, louder and closer. Vanessa hears them too and looks pale. I'll never forget the sense of dread I felt then. The hairs behind my neck and back stand up, and we remained close and very tense. I yelled when I heard Bill asking who was out there. but we had heard no answers. Next morning, we found scratching draws again. Something looked very simply drawn. People, it was all weird. That day, we left the woods and kept on working on the open fields. To this day, I'm really glad we left those woods. I really want to think that whatever witchy thing that lives there just left us alone and realized we moved out of its area. This is a story that happened to my mother's cousin quite a long time ago. He used to work as a park ranger in the Chilean Patagonia. I've never visited the place myself, but he, we'll call him Carlos, would tell me stories about the wilderness and the vast landscape. He'd spend days alone, surveying, checking the state of wilderness. According to my uncle, he'd often meet with a companion, but every once in a while, they'd had portable radios with them and would speak to one another. Sometimes, they'd meet archaeologists and geologists working in the area, and the rangers would have to guide them around, and checking on them every once in a while. There weren't many dangerous things there, just nature and other people. And by people, I mean poachers. Cougars live there, and animals are being looked after. There are issues with indigenous people's claims over the lands. However, my uncle never had to deal with anything particularly dangerous. Like, he'd try to get along with everybody and do his job. Poachers are dangerous, and very few times they'd actually receive news about drug dealers carrying their stuff towards Argentina from there, like the cartel. The deep wild is crazy, and a good place for creepy stuff to happen. So, on a very cold night, my uncle was walking across the forest. Everything was dark and he was walking around, not too far from his camp. He had his lights on with him, to make sure nothing would try to hunt him down. Everything seemed pretty calm, naturally, of course, and he returned, then turned out his fire. He left only one light on. He went to sleep and woke up around 3:30 a.m., maybe about 4. He reported hearing strange noises. To this day, he says he had heard a motor from a car in the middle of nowhere. There was a small trail actually close by to him, but you never see the vehicles unless it was some emergency. It didn't have asphalt, just a dirty road. So my uncle wakes up and leaves the tent. He says the night was silent, no sounds, and starts hearing shootings, lights, yellow and orange lights. In front of him, far away, left and right, moving quickly. He never saw figures, just shooting and lights. Carlos then felt a chill run down his spine, and to this day, my uncle swears that he never felt a feeling of dread before, until now. Hunters can be violent and unpredictable, and what was creepier is you never know what would happen. Suddenly, out of nowhere, 2 cougars sprint by his side, passing him, running towards the woods. The animals completely ignoring him, and just keeps running. And my uncle claims he spent a big amount of time hearing shootings and seeing lights, and at some point, he wasn't sure if he had also heard human voices too. The noises and lights soon disappeared into the night, and to this day, he hopes and prays for the cougars to have made it alive from the hunters. The park we work at is one of the largest, and by far the creepiest in all of North America. My colleagues and I, in the many nights that we have worked here, have had several bone-chilling encounters with the paranormal that would easily drive just about anybody insane. We have built somewhat of a tolerance to it, however, and simply accepted it as a part of the job. Weird creatures, random apparitions, and strange figures, you name it. We have experienced it all. While I cannot tell you the exact name or location of my workplace, this park is that one you have probably heard of. The story I'm going to tell you is one of the times that literally shook me inside out. This is the closest that I have ever come to fully considering quitting the job. It's not every day that happens. You see, since I love my job more than anything else. However, there comes times in your life that you have to question the most basic decisions, beginning with your sanity. This was definitely one of those. I was at patrol duty for the night. I usually always am, unless there is an emergency or something else that requires my attention in daytime. My shift that night was a rather short one, 5 hours. I still felt pretty lazy that day. I did not have a partner in that station, but you usually come across a coworker on patrol every now and then, so you're never truly lonely. Anyway, like any other day, I'd woke up at 7 p.m., made some coffee, had taken a shower and gotten my clothes on. I'm pretty fond of listening to music on the walks, so I put one of my earbuds in my left ear and set my playlist on shuffle. Every patrol is exciting. You never know what or who you may encounter. I have met and guided many lost hikers, seen and escaped crazy wild animals. I've also played things like geocaching and treasure hunting with other rangers. If you enjoy the freedom and adventure, and being alone in a forest doesn't scare you too much, I'd suggest you join the ranger team. Anyway though, I had been walking for a couple of hours when it had happened. In the distance, I see a man walking towards me, taking him to be just another lost hiker. As I approached, I called out to him. As I went near, I got the discernment that the man was drunk. While he was facing in my direction, I could see his eyes were fixated at something in the sky overhead. He was also smiling very, very wide, in a very creepy way. Now I'll say he was not walking normally. He had raised his knees to his chest with every step, and would be swinging his arms in a very exaggerated manner every few seconds. It almost appeared animated. I called out to him. I admit, I was a little scared, and he was fully prepared to bring out my firearm if anything had went south. The man had continued walking towards me, but made no indication that he had even noticed my presence, even though I had been calling out to him repeatedly. I felt something off about the whole thing, and it was not just the way he walked or smiled. I began dreading every step he took towards me for some reason. His gaze towards the sky over my head had not budged for a second, and neither had his extremely wide smile. A few seconds later, he came face to face with me, but did not stop walking. I noticed an old iPod shuffle clipped to the bottom of his t-shirt, with an earphone wire leading to his left ear. Then it hit me. As the man walked past me, I did not call out to him again. That man had looked exactly like me. I couldn't see it before, but when I noticed the iPod, everything had hit me all at once. It was the same model and color as mine. Even his t-shirt, his outfit, trousers, and shoes were exactly identical to the clothing I wore and owned. He had exactly my face, and if I could ever smile in that creepy fashion, I would have looked just like that. Scared out of my mind, I turned around, but he was nowhere to be found. He had just disappeared into the air, right after passing me, as my heart threatened to beat the hell out of my chest, making its way outside. I took a few deep breaths as a futile attempt to try and calm myself down. Every hair on my body was erect, and I might have been close to having a panic attack. Somehow, I managed to tell myself that I had hallucinated and continued on with the patrol. A few minutes later, I saw him again, in the distance from the very same direction that I had initially saw him coming. There he was again, walking his weird walk, smiling that creepy smile, swinging his arms and facing at that very same spot over my head. I was nearly pooping myself at the sight. I bolted. Thanks to the amount of cardio we get every day as a part of the job, I have the stamina of a gazelle on crack. I ran like I had never done before, until I felt safe, which was quite some time. The sun was rising at this point. I sat down on the ground with my back to this huge tree, trying to calm myself. The light from the rising sun gave me some form of courage, and I was rather thankful for that my anal sphincter had not totally given up on me. A coworker of mine, Smith, who was probably also on duty, saw me. With a worried look on his face, he approached me. When I told him of that encounter, he had no issues believing me. Considering the amount of stuff every one of us has seen, everyone believes everybody. I swear, rangers can sometimes be the most supportive people out there. I went back to the station with him, changed my clothes, and showered. Anyway, I've heard from movies and stories that you can come across your doppelganger, and you will die soon after. There's nothing you can do about it. Well, I had seen mine last year, and here I am, still alive. So, I guess that's a lie, or a myth. But I tell you this, in case I ever come across that thing again, I'm either shooting him down into the ground, or quitting and moving. I often volunteer during the summer to be a ranger for our local forest, and to help out with the increased number of people coming for camping. After all, these past few years have been a little more hectic than usual. This year, though, just a few weeks ago, I did it too. I was heading a group of 11. There were 10 kids and their class teacher, who we'll call Mrs. Mindy, was there as well. We walked over the trail for a couple of hours, stopping in between for short bathroom breaks and doing a fun activity that she had organized. Whenever they started to feel bored, we would do this activity. I think they did all sorts of games, trying to look at the bugs and other animals, identify moss and sorts of vegetation on fallen logs. I wasn't too fond, but what could I say? It wasn't that dangerous. Anyway, we decided to stop about a few kilometers into the forest, setting up camp. That was the most fun part. They really enjoyed it. Miss Mindy had set them up in groups of 3 for each tent. We had also spread out, got kindling and wood for lighting up a campfire. It was summer, which means it was the perfect weather for roasting marshmallows, wieners, and giving these kids a real live camping experience. I listened quietly to everybody talking, laughing amongst themselves and enjoying a whole new experience. Then it was off to bed for everybody at about 9:30. I, of course, was still awake. I'm a night owl, and so I usually have problems falling asleep anyway, before midnight. I had been reading, so I just thought I would go and lie inside my tent before I'm about to sleep. The night was quiet, and the night was fully lit, illuminated by the beautiful moon. As I'm lost in my book, I hear rustling and crunching of leaves, as if somebody was walking out near the trail. Immediately, I feel on high alert. This could have been a wild bear or some other animal. After all, we had been roasting marshmallows and hot dogs. The thing that came out of the shadows of the angle of the moon's lighting was just enough for me to make out a faint silhouette, but nothing more than that. It was a woman. I could see the white dress that looked almost like a nightdress. She was barefoot, placed back and forth in the distance in the same place occasionally, throwing a look or two towards the tents we had set up. I watched all of this happening as my tent flaps were completely open, gazing off into the night. At first, I thought about asking her if she needed help, but let me tell you that we're here into the woods and no regular people just walk up down the trail alone at night in this kind of outfit. This struck me as very peculiar, and my gut, I just knew something was very, very off. She began to kind of stop and take a few steps closer, as if thinking something. Then, she would just stop and step back, almost hesitantly. I could not tell you how long this kept up, until she eventually gave up, walking back into the night. And as she turned around, to my terror, she had the largest knife in the back of her hand tucked behind her back. After she walked off and disappeared, I kept my eyes peeled until almost an hour had passed, radioing my boss about what I had seen. We kept a lookout and scouted the area, but we never found her or who she was after that. I never told the lady or the kids. It's best not to scare them anyway. It was 1982, and I was working as a park ranger in Idaho State. It was actually my 5th posting as a ranger, and it being a large national park, I was very excited. We usually worked in isolated research areas, mainly located in deeper forestry. I was waiting at a receive site where my fellow colleagues were going to come and receive me in. I was waiting for roughly around 2 hours, but nobody had came. This is when I decided to go there by myself, and I heard a vehicle approaching. There were the fellow rangers waiting for me. When I got into the back seat of the vehicle, it felt very weird for some unknown reasons. I had asked what kind of environment is in there, but their reactions were like fine and okay. When I looked to the other side for a moment, I thought there was a woman who had walked past a big tree. I had asked the driver to stop for some time and explain the situation. They were denying the fact that it is a restricted area, so none of the people, excluding working personnel, will be present here. I was convinced with their explanation. I wish I insisted on stopping right then and right there. When we had reached the center, it was very woodsy and somewhat shady. There was this board which was pointing towards the center. I had a bad feeling here, but once I made it in and talked to my senior official, he gave me a very cold look. It was early summer, and a woman came to our station, reporting that her husband saw something weird when he was taking pictures. He was going to come to our station and report the incident, but he had left and never returned. She seemed very troubled and worried. I had left with her to see if we can go properly investigate. Maybe we can find out where he was before we had to call in search and rescue. So I go and walk with her back to their campsite to see if possibly we can find out where he went or get any signs. What I heard scares me. I heard a scream off in the distance that sounded like a woman. After going to investigate, the sound was right near her camp, and we go running. There, the woman and I catch this figure that was all white, roughly around 5 feet tall, very large hands and long, spindly fingers. The woman and I also noticed a very foul-smelling odor. I stood up, walked towards this thing, and it quickly disappeared, running off into the trees. I tried to get a better look and told her to stay there. I wasn't sure if this was somebody playing a prank, or if my eyes were deceiving me, playing a trick on me. I ventured further, but as soon as I got near the tree line where I saw this figure escape, I got a very, very bad feeling. It felt like I was not supposed to go any further. In fact, my instincts were screaming at me to stop. In hindsight, I probably should have trusted my instincts. After pursuing what I initially thought was a person, I found these strange tracks in the ground. They were human-like, but not quite. They also appeared to have claw marks and about 4 or 5 toes. It looked more like a large reptile foot than anything. Now that everything was adding up in my head, I thought I was seriously being pranked. So I called in my supervisor, let him know exactly what was happening. He told me to report right back to the office, now. I left and assured the woman that everything would be okay. We would get search and rescue and help to find her husband. I told her to wait at the campsite. I arrived back at the center, where I was forced to sit down and tell my boss exactly what I had seen. About halfway through of telling him what I had seen, he interrupted me, stopping me right there, not letting me finish any further, explaining I was to stop right now and not to speak about it again. There are things in this park we are not to know about. I asked him, is this a cover-up? Are we supposed to be silent about certain things, or possibly, do we have jurisdiction to deal with these kinds of issues? My boss looked at me, gave me a long, drawn-out sigh, and explained there were certain government entities that we are contracted with who deal with issues we are not supposed to deal with. That's pretty much all he said. Reminded me that I'm supposed to keep my mouth shut if I want to keep my career. I'm sorry my experience isn't more exciting. That's about all I'm willing to say. I don't want to give away too much more in case I'm outed and I do lose my career. I do find it incredibly odd because I know I was not hallucinating and it was not a nightmare. This was during the day and I had full light and I could see that this was clearly either a person in a very expensive movie tier costume, or I really did see something, some sort of humanoid. One of the weirdest things I've seen in my 20 years of working as a ranger in Yellowstone National Park was immaculately detailed and almost real hands nailed to trees, and not just a few. It was August, a few months back in 2015, and the hiking trails had just reopened again for people to join. Only the park rangers had been allowed to visit at night and go on about our daily work around the park, making sure everything was still all right. Nobody ever visited or went into the woods on any of our watch. We have somebody watching and patrolling 24/7. We got our first group that another ranger, we'll call him Mark, would oversee and help out. It was a family of 7, 5 kids and parents, pretty energetic and excited to be outside of their house. I watched them walk off on the trail, disappearing with Mark. I began walking in a direction different on my patrolling routine. I was a little ways into the forest when I began hearing screams. It looked like the kids I'd seen gone off into the hiking trail earlier, so I ran as fast as I could, making my way towards the directions of the scream. I was absolutely out of breath by the time I reached and took a quick look, counted all the people, and it was all 7. Thankfully, I bent down on my knees while trying to catch my breath, asking them what the matter was. Mark was still standing with them. One of the kids had pointed in the forward direction. I followed his hand, and at first, I didn't spoil anything. But when I paid attention, there was something small, pale-colored, nailed onto the tree. Mark and I had informed them to stay back while we stepped forward, realizing they were severed hands. Who would do something like this? And there wasn't just one. Many trees had a different hand nailed to it, left and right. It was sick. I gathered the courage and touched them. It wasn't like skin, it was like a rough fabric. I could feel the soft fiber. They were actually some of the most realistic-looking hands I'd ever seen. They were all fake. Possibly some creep, or not. Who would go inside to a park and nail hands into a tree? Fake hands at that. Well, we never found out, but it stopped after this day. I'm sorry if this story isn't all that scary, but it's definitely disturbing, to say the least. During my time as a ranger in central Missouri, I've had a fair share of situations that range from mildly spooky to extremely gory. I've saved people who got lost in the forest. I found more than 10 dead bodies, some of which were murder victims. But no experience can even start to compare what happened in the autumn of 2016. At the very beginning of autumn, camping is the most popular activity for outdoor lovers. The weather is perfect for it. Nature and wildlife are at an all-time peak at this time of year. As the leaves change from yellow, sunsets are really special, especially out here during early autumn. Although it is beautiful and fun to spend nights out here camping, for us rangers, this means a lot of extra work and a lot of trouble during this time. Everything from finding lost people to clearing brush out of trails. Careless people tend to even forget to put out fires, throwing cigarettes and starting small wildfires that we need to prevent. Others feed wildlife, or bring too much food with them and make them a target for things like bears and draw other predators in the areas. Speaking of bears, black bears are one of those animals that I've seen victims of bear attacks. They would not even get recognized by their own families after what they've been through. This particular night that I will tell you about, there were no bear attacks, no fires, not even reports of lost people. The whole evening was uneventful and peaceful. Too peaceful. I was sitting at the station, watching TV with a buddy, and out of nowhere, a beacon of light fell from the sky, straight into the forest. It happened very quickly, but the light was so bright, it was impossible to miss, and it definitely was not made by a human. The light wasn't very close to us. We did not hear anything before or after it appeared. But we just had to investigate. Curiosity got the best of us. We had put our guns in the holster, picked up our lights, and headed in the direction. Naturally, we felt fairly uneasy, but still excited. We talked the entire time, exchanging ideas and scenarios in our heads of what the light meant. Maybe it was aliens and we could make contact. Maybe it was some meteor or a UFO crashing down. The more we talked, the more excited we had got. After a while of walking, we had finally made it to a place where we saw the light. There was a small part of the grass that looked scorched, like somebody had made a fire there recently. We would probably still think that if Jim hadn't noticed something under a tree a few steps away. There was also a cracked shell that was smoking. It looked like an odd egg, but it was bigger than an ostrich egg, and it was empty. The uneasy feeling began growing inside me, and the excitement was now gone. We were just about to head back to the station and call for somebody to take a look at the egg when we had heard a sound of a deer. It sounded like it was caught in a bear trap and crying out in pain. We both headed in the direction of the sound to see if we could see when the strangest thing happened. The woods around us fell silent. Usually when an animal gets hurt like that, it will yelp out in pain for hours until somebody finds them, or until they lose enough blood to die, or if something else gets them. The deer was now silent after less than a minute. It made us feel very uneasy about the whole situation. Now, we weren't talking. At this point, we were both intently listening, carefully trying to hear anything around us, and that's when we witnessed it. Something was standing hunched over a dead deer's body, with teeth sunken into the neck. Now that we were close enough, I could hear slurping sounds that were muffled, and realized this thing was sucking the blood out of the deer's neck. I waved to my colleague, just crouch and to not move. We stood there, observing this bizarre and frightening sight. After a moment or two, it seemed that the thing finished its meal and kind of crawled away, still bent over in all fours. We waited for another minute to be sure that this animal left before we began sneaking back. But we were not quiet enough. Only a few seconds later, Jim stepped on a broken stick, and it cracked very loudly. We froze in place, trying to figure out if we were heard, and then something let out a fierce, deep growl not far behind us. We both took out our pistols and started running like cowards. We could hear that whatever this thing was now furiously moving behind us like a rabid dog. I felt it getting closer and closer, so I turned around and tried to shoot at it to slow it down. But before I could even aim, it jumped, jumping up into the tree. What I saw looked like something out of a nightmare, like a large black dog with long tendrils behind it. After we successfully made it back to the station, even though this thing had pursued us, nothing had happened. We never heard anything more. We decided and debated on calling our supervisor about this, but decided against it. We waited there armed the entire night, expecting something to happen, and neglected our nightly patrols. When the morning came, we went out again to investigate on first light. Even though it was past our shift, no traces of it were there. Not the egg and not it. I don't know if it's some mass hallucination, or we really did experience something out of the paranormal. Even the deer carcass was gone. We believe something happened. Perhaps we'd stepped into the twilight zone momentarily. I just hope it never happens again. It was my very first week at the national park in Minnesota. I'm not disclosing the actual park or the actual location. You guys, I don't want to get doxxed. We'll call it Never Going Back Park. After working there for a week, I never did go back. It was my first week, and the woman I was training under was about to leave. This way, I could finish the rest of my shift solo. She had some sort of party to attend, and this was my last training day anyway. I assured her I'd be fine if she took off 4 hours early. After all, my duties were simple. I answered phones, walked the grounds, and kept order. It wasn't like it was rocket science. I spent the first half of my Saturday morning answering some insane calls. Teenagers being teenagers. People couldn't stand to see them enjoying themselves, and they were often shut down for their fun. There were, of course, also idiots feeding bears and people wondering why the cliff was roped off. Nothing I couldn't handle in the long run. Honestly, I spent the majority of my shift scrolling through Reddit, reading ghost stories and things to try and keep myself remotely and mentally sane. They were interesting, if not overwhelmingly phony. They kept me from being overwhelmed by my own boredom, actually. It was after lunch by the time I got anything worthwhile. A frantic woman was screaming into the phone about how she needed police. All the while, I remained trying to calm her. Her words were slurred, a muddled mess. I spent entirely too long trying to understand what kind of bear she tried to pet. It turns out this call was not bear-related. There was something standing at the edge of a cliff, refusing to be coaxed back over the safety tape. I could not remember ever moving as quickly as I did in that very moment. I grabbed my phone and my handbook, running for the cart. We'd covered this in training. I was to call police from the hub for all things suicide-related, but I was afraid I was too late. I called them on their way there, taking turns like I'd gone mad. And when I had arrived, there was nobody around, period. So, I slowly made my way, creeping to the edge, afraid that it was far too late. When the woman came into view, dozens of feet down but fine, I breathed a sigh of relief. She was sobbing into her hands, wailing as grief consumed her. I wished I could comfort her. Paramedics were on their way, but I couldn't let her stay down there all by myself. If she decided to try again, there would be no lucky edge to catch her. My skin crawled when I called out to her, as if something were doing something that I shouldn't have been. I ignored it, pushing onward as I tried in vain to get her attention. When all else failed, I settled on using my authority as leverage. You shouldn't be down there. You could get seriously hurt. It sounded lame even to my own ears, and I even regret opening my mouth as her wailing had continued. Her cries were awful and shrill, and the longer she screamed, the more it felt like a blur in my mind. I remembered scrambling away from the edge as the world rocked, and my ability to tell up from down became twisted and warped. But as my equilibrium flipped and tipped, my senses zeroed in on her voice. The nondescript wailing was enraged. There was no sadness, no remorse, only hatred as she taunted me. She screamed at me to jump. "If you care so much, come down here and get me," she had taunted. When I struggled to get back away from the ledge, a crackling chants of "fall, fall, fall" joined the fray. My hand missed the rock, and as my eyes shot open in surprise, I was met with a flash of glee that was clear on her twisted face. I still remember her empty eye holes. Her features were rotten, and her nose seemed like it was melting off her face, maggots crawling along her skin and making the holes in her flesh as they did. In that very moment, I saw my own body falling, crashing amongst the sharp rocks, hidden by the ledge and joining the countless other bodies that met the same unfortunate fate. To this day, I wondered if the others had seen their own demise in the same way she was seeing hers. Did they flail and scream the way she tried? Or did they flip out over the edge without vision? I don't know, and I likely never would. Luckily, a strong hand came down on my shoulder, pulling me back up. Her first words were sharp, as if I were the imbecile in the situation, and not somebody who was trying to save somebody else. Cliff 7 is roped off for a reason. I was disoriented from the near fall, and his harsh tone wasn't helping matters. I managed to tell him that I was new before he continued in on me. I hadn't been scolded so thoroughly in years. The gist of his squawking was simple, in retrospect. The lady of the ledge had a history of luring people, only to trick them, falling to their death. giving you grand visions of all the bodies that had fallen before. Realistically, there were no bodies down there. Otherwise, search and rescue would have retrieved them. The Lady of the Ledge had a history of luring people in, only to trick them. It only took approaching the edge of the ledge for her to activate her spell, and the amount of calls people received, apparently obscene. The number of families they were forced to call and report their loved ones were unrecoverable. Honestly, I'd love to end this in a more interesting way. To say I went back the next day to investigate would be an understatement. I would have loved to say that, but I did not. This was, without a doubt, a horrific experience that had happened to me. It was the year 2005, and I had just turned 30, and also was a well-paid ranger. I loved my job and the fondness towards nature. But something paranormal happened during my duty. I'm going to refuse to name the park. I want to avoid any potential lawsuits or anything legal coming against me. The incident in question still gives me chills whenever I remember it. I had to resign because of this incident. I can remember. It was a chilly, foggy morning in the middle of December. Me and one of my coworkers, who we'll call Sean, we were assigned duty to cover park grounds, looking for any stragglers sleeping in the park. We were clad in thick sweaters and big boots. The cold winds were blowing, and snow had covered the ground so much, no grass was visible. The trees were covered, and even though it looked beautiful, like a serene scene out of Narnia, it was cold, and thus very unenjoyable. Also, the park was eerily quiet. It was stupid assigning us this duty. No sane person would try and sleep in this. We struggled to walk, due to how heavy the snow and fog were. We could not see anything more than a meter ahead of us. Our eyes had a hard time adjusting. Me and Sean decided to split up, check the grounds for 10 more meters so we could cover more ground faster, going back inside, away from this horrible, unforgiving cold. Not more than 10 meters because we did not want to lose sight of each other in this dense fog. To aid in finding our way back, we marked X on trees with chalk. I walked for 5 more meters, shouting. They could show themselves and hopefully be guided back to safety. When nobody replied, I turned back. I didn't cover 10 meters because I got lazy. I was freezing. When I came back to our meeting spot, I could see Sean standing there, his back towards me and one hand on the tree, in a very stiff posture. I thought he was looking for me, so I shouted him to come back here. When he did not reply or even turn back, I thought he was fooling around or something. I had walked over to him. I tapped on his shoulder from behind, but he didn't turn back. As I had raised my hand to tap him again, I heard my name being called by Sean from behind, telling me that we should go back. This made me freeze. If Sean was behind me and calling me in a very familiar voice, then who was this, dressed similar to Sean? The body turned, snapping me out of my thoughts, and what I saw was unexplainable. The guy was wearing the same clothes as Sean, but had no face. Like literally no face. Instead of a face, it had a white oval-like structure, but no eyes or mouth. Scared out of my wits, I turned back and began running, all I could through the snow. It was deep, and I kept slipping. I could hear clothes and things rustling behind me, as I knew I was being followed. Not once did I stop and look back. I kept running, all the way till I'd reached Sean, who had real face and real facial features. I told him to run till we reached our cabin. When we finally did, he tried asking me what was the matter and why I was acting so crazy. I couldn't reply to him. I was breathless and shocked for what I had seen. I remember shakingly telling him to lock all the doors and windows. After calming down, I told him what had happened and how I had seen something faceless dressed just like him. He didn't believe me, said it must have been the fog playing tricks on my eyes. It doesn't make any sense. He offered me water and suggested I'm probably sleep deprived maybe I had a hallucination. He told me not to share the story or else, well, I would get in trouble. I figured nobody would believe me anyway, so I never really mentioned this to anybody. Until now. Even as I type this out, it just feels so unreal. I wonder if anybody will ever believe me. Shortly after this, I resigned. The incident had shaken me to the core, and frankly, I don't know what it was that I encountered. I believe it was a demon. Their abilities are unknown, and it's only common sense that one stays away from such unexplainable things. I don't regret leaving it. It was for my own safety. I can't even imagine what that thing wanted to do by wearing its body. How many people had become entrapped? Maybe this thing was behind the increased disappearances of tourists. Although, the information about increased disappearances never was released to the public, so tourists and visitors won't be lost. All of us rangers were informed by the higher-ups. We were told to stay on high alert, and we could stop these disappearances and tourists from wandering off during the cold season. Even after I'd resigned, they'd made me sign an NDA, so legally, I'm defying that. I feel like if I try and stay anonymous, I won't have to face the serious consequences. In the meantime, any answers are greatly appreciated, or even mere speculation, or are barely there. Story 13. Strange Lights. Back in 2013, for around a 6-month period, I was the main guy to be patrolling the park. Sure, everybody else had their duties, but the evening time was my shift. I wasn't really doing anything special, just the pretty much mundane doing my rotations, looking for anything out of the ordinary, which I hardly did find. But there were a handful of times here and there that I experienced some things I can't quite explain. As a matter of fact, one evening, as I'm driving by myself, I see this weird flash of light in the sky, kind of like lightning. Yeah, think about that. But this was not a lightning bolt. In fact, the sky was clear of any overcast or weather patterns. In fact, I could see stars. What came after that bright flash was this large black object, slowly rotating and moving in the sky in a very strange direction. It's like it was going vertical, but east to west at the same time. I couldn't tell if I was looking at a cube or a circle or what this was. And I'm watching this thing, and it's moving all over the sky. And then another bright white flashes. Boom, it's gone. No trace of it. I just remember thinking, what the? Did I just see that? Trying to process what indeed I just seen, which I'm very confident was indeed a UFO. That was the precursor to this whole experience, because shortly after that, I would be driving towards the end of my shift, having completely forgot about this whole strange shape that I saw in the sky. Next thing you know, I'm enveloped by this incredibly blinding bright white light. Then, I look down at my clock. I'm somehow an hour and a half behind. What? I somehow went back in time. Of course, I didn't get enveloped by the light, and all of a sudden looked down at my clock. I'm just telling you what happened as far as an event had occurred. I have no way to explain what that was about and how that came together. The light enveloped me as soon as it dissipated. My clock before this was about 9:02 because I was about ready to clock off. When I came out of the light and it fully dissipated, it was now about 7:40. It was still dark out, so I could only assume I had gone backwards in time. I know that might be a crazy assumption, but afterwards I immediately went back to the station and began talking to my colleague who was sitting there at the desk. I was freaking out, of course, telling him what had just happened, explaining to him it was just 9:02 and now it's 7:40. He gave me a very strange look and said, "It's still an hour and 20 minutes till 9 p.m. Have you been drinking? Are you okay? Do you need to lie down?" I explained to him I swear what happened, that I swear that I was taken back in time by that same shape in the sky. I was not ready to write off that coincidence just yet. It still goes down as the most bizarre, freakiest story I've ever encountered while in the Ranger service. Story 14. The Winged Demon. Hi, I'm writing in a story about an event that happened roughly 15 years ago, during the autumn back in 2001. That was the year I was doing my final exam as an environmental science student with the University of Exeter in England. For my final year, I was required to complete work experience, and I chose to complete mine as a wildlife ranger at the Forest of Holyhead, a wild, vast expanse of forest which spans for 7 miles in width and 12 in length. The whole experience was a dream come true, as I thoroughly enjoyed the job, loved spending time with the like-minded individuals who had a passion for nature. I had no idea where there were so many insects and creatures which I had been unaware even existed. The experience was scheduled to last only 6 months in total, but unfortunately was cut short at 4 months, as something terrible and spooky happened, something which has haunted me these 15 years and has now prompted me to put pen to paper. When I first started my work experience, my supervisor, whom we'll call Allison, a red-haired lady in her early 60s, very close to retirement, warned me, and I kid you not, of sinister forces in the forest. When I pushed for details, she got kind of shady and nervous, did not want to speak further. It was the strangest thing. Allison was usually very jolly and very happy, upbeat, but talking about these sinister details, it would make her on edge. She just kept explaining to me, "Be careful." I assumed she meant shady guys roaming the forest at night, maybe cruising, or perhaps drug dealers used it as a meeting point. My mind did not go beyond that level of sinister operation. When I mentioned the conversation to the rest of my fellow colleagues, they too looked uneasy. They reminded me of a young boy, who we'll call Kyle, who was aged 7. He had gone missing in 1996 on a picnic with his family, had never been seen since. His grandmother spoke of something black and on fire that claimed her grandson. Weeks after his disappearance, she herself was admitted to the hospital, where it was later found she was suffering from advanced dementia and died shortly afterwards. My colleagues informed me that Kyle's parents never stopped searching for him. They believed something terrible and supernatural had happened in that forest, something of which had taken him and driven his grandmother to the edge. I speculate that the story may have been some ring of truth, possibly exaggerated over time, possibly for suspense or thriller purposes. Everyone loved a good ghost story, especially one about a forest. The story sounded spooky, but as I looked out at the autumn colors in the forest, I could never believe something that evil could occur out there. It looked picturesque, a haven for any creature. I was also shocked, as a large part of her job was to promote the use of the forest for people. If the story was true, then we were essentially promoting a murder playground. How could we get families to come? I thought. I dismissed the story as bogus, even laughing a little at my colleagues. They just told me to keep my mind open, that the forest had a long history of disappearances. I figured they had smoked too much. I even asked the secretary. She said She had been working in the forest industry for 30 years, but was adamant it was surely haunted. A few of us student rangers shared a cabin together in training. One night, we told each other ghost stories. There were 3 other guys in the cabin as well, so it was very boisterous and lively. The odd time we would have girls over, if we all got drunk, we would go skinny dipping in a nearby lake. It was a lot of fun. I was only 22, having the time of my life. There was a lot of crude jokes and pranks going on in the cabin, especially after several beers had been consumed. This night, one of the other guys, we'll call him Brian, got really drunk, began acting crazy. He opened the door to our cabin, yelling out like crazy. That's when he started yelling about Kyle, asking him if he boned Granny. A few of the other guys laughed at him, but it made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know what to believe regarding this story about little Kyle's disappearance, but I knew it was beyond jokes. It was distasteful, as my mother always said, and karma has this funny way of getting to you. I explained to him, knock it off and come back inside, but he just kept yelling in a goofy voice. Just strange stuff. I couldn't believe he was acting this way. It was cringeworthy. Eventually, he came back inside, and we settled down for the night. When I awoke at 3 a.m., I looked over at Brian's bed just to check that he had not been sick. I squinted in the darkness. I couldn't make out his figure. I got up and went for a closer look at his bed. He was gone. His quilt perfectly made, which was the eeriest thing. His bed was always a mess, no matter what time of day it was. Why had he made his bed? I distinctly remember him getting into bed, snoring almost instantly. I panicked, checking the bathroom, the kitchen, our small living room. He was gone. I woke the others. We were all pretty spooked that he was nowhere to be found. He was in no fit state to go anywhere, and if he did, he would have likely fallen down or possibly drowned. We got dressed with our flashlights. Remember, this was 2001, so long before portable phones and really good flashlights. We decided to break up and start searching. I looked in our indoors bathroom, made sure he had not passed out in there. No sign of him. There were no signs of him around the cabin, but we did notice what looked to be fresh footprints leading into the darkened forest. It was like looking into a vast ocean of blackness, with the only sounds of hoots of owls or the trees swaying back and forth in a gentle wind. We began to get a little nervous, as although we loved the forest, it looked pretty creepy at night. I figured there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps Brian just went out for a walk and was going to stagger back to the cabin. But then I remember his actions. Just a few hours earlier, how taunting his voice had been, mocking the little boy who had disappeared. Icy fear welled in my stomach, and I wondered if any of the other guys had the same thoughts. I continued calling out, "Brian, can you hear me?" Nothing. My footsteps thread on the autumn leaves, crunching on the forest floor. This would have been a beautiful walk, had it not been for the fear of Brian's disappearance. I tried to illuminate as much as I could, carefully concentrated on every sound I could hear. I could hear him talking. "Help, help." His voice sounding anguished, sounding disembodied, but yet clear enough to make out. It sounded as if he was coming deeper in the forest. I gulped as I noticed how black and far in I was getting. I told him I'm coming. I called back. My heart was racing, not knowing what I was about to encounter. "Please help me. Help me." His voice was agonizing to hear in this state. I had never heard him in such pain or distress. He was clearly pleading, as if in his last moments. My heart felt like it was going to rip out of my chest. I began running, turning my head left to right, cautiously examining every little illuminated detail for any sign of Brian. I realized how utterly helpless I was. If he was able to be held by something sinister or dangerous, I had no defense mechanism. I was empty-handed, vulnerable, but still, I knew I had to save him. Although he had been a complete jerk, he did not deserve to die. I couldn't even bear to think what that would mean. The next sounds I heard were a large amount of frantic screaming. It sounded as if it was from a wild animal, but no one I knew it was from Brian. I began crying, starting to think it was in his last moments, asking, "Where are you?" I could hear him sobbing. I was now running, arms raised and ready to fight whatever man or beast was holding my friend captive. Then I stopped. Before me on the ground was Brian. He was kneeling and sobbing, dressed only in his boxers. His head was in the ground, and he was beating the forest floor with his fists. He had large red scrapes all down his back and a gash on his cheek. I walked up to him, being fully aware this could be a trick, and this might not be Brian. But he turned to see me, and I knew from his eyes, vulnerable and terrified, that this was indeed my friend. I held on to him, putting his head in mine, allowing him to sob. I watched closely all around me to see if whatever had caused this distress to Brian would reappear. It was getting light now. It must have been 4:30 a.m. I felt whatever it was now gone. The other guys eventually found us, and we all helped to carry Brian back to the cabin. We told our supervisors and senior ranger what had occurred, not mentioning Brian's taunts towards the little boy Kyle. Brian was bedridden for 2 weeks, then had to be brought into the hospital for a severely infected wound. He never came back. We got a phone call about 6 weeks later, saying that his mother would be arriving to take Brian's stuff back. We asked how he was. Not good. I still haven't seen him for years now. But actually, I bumped into his mother about 2 years prior. He's been in a mental ward for the last 14 years. Whatever happened to him that night changed him forever. All he talks about is something black, fiery wings, and a viper's tongue that nearly took his life. Some of the other guys don't believe it at all, but I feel as a ranger, something happened to Brian in the forest. Something dark. Allison had warned me after all. I don't know if it was the kid that took Brian or something else, but he was traumatized. I lost my friend to whatever happened in that forest. All the guys left after Brian's mom took his stuff out. Many of us could not sleep at night, not knowing what was out there in the forest. I don't know what happened to Brian exactly, but it was something terrible, and every time I think about that night, I still get shivers going up my spine. Story 15. Death Becomes Her. Hello, what lurks beneath. I can't tell you my name, or where I actually work, but for the sake of what I have to relate to you, I will use the name Jim, and I will tell you that I do work for the forest service industry, where a stone is a particularly sunny color. Do you understand? I know that you usually deal in cryptid encounters, but I've come across some things that are just as out of this world and paranormal as you would ever understand. There's a few playgrounds scattered throughout the park. I mean, you'd expect that, having as many tourists as we do. Often, it's part of my job to patrol these in a regular circuit to make sure that things stay compliant, if you catch my drift. The way I usually carry this out, I park my car, I sit and watch for a few minutes, then I get out, take a stroll. If all's well, I go on to the next area. In the middle of one exceptionally boring day, I was doing my usual strolling. During a very busy hour, kids were out of school and parents were letting them run wild, probably hoping they would leave all that energy here. I watched as this little boy reminded me very much of my own son. A little girl with very white, rather pale skin and straight black hair ran over to him, asked if he wanted to come meet her grandparents. They were sitting over on a park bench with their backs to us. I kind of smiled at how easily children can make friends. Adults have a lot to learn. Towards the end of the day, there was the announcement of an Amber Alert. A very small boy had gone missing. A picture of the boy was officially released. It was the exact little boy I had seen with that little pale girl. There were gears turning in the back of my head all night, and I just could not put a finger on what it was that was bothering me. The next day, I was on patrol again, with orders to keep my eyes peeled for that same little boy that I had saw the day prior. I kept my eyes peeled for him all day. After all, he'd be hard to miss. He looked just like my son. I saw the same little girl from the day before, the pale skin and the dark hair. She came up to yet another little girl, asked her if she would like to meet her grandparents. That's when those gears in my head began working. There they were again, two older folks sitting with their back to all the kids sitting on a bench further up the trail. My eyes shifted over to the dark-haired girl and her new friend who were agreeing to go meet the grandma and grandpa. That's when I made my move. "Excuse me, can I meet your grandparents too?" She wasn't happy to see me. She looked like I was ruining some fun of hers. She took the other girl's hand and led her up the trail, keeping me in sight with a sidelong look. I followed from a distance. The two girls stood in front of the couple. The dark-haired girl was definitely not happy to see me. The other girl looked confused, even a little frightened. "Okay," said the dark-haired girl, and rushed her new friend back to the playground. I strolled up to the older folks. They did not seem to notice me. I call that a greeting, as to not startle them. I thought they just might be hard of hearing, but they didn't stir a bit. When I came around to stand in front of them, I could see they were two withered up dead bodies, dry as dead leaves. Another Amber Alert went out that night, that time for the other little girl that the dark-haired one had led away from me. Story 16. The Ritual. I grew up in the mountain, west, and have had a strong love for the outdoors as long as I could remember, actually. Something about the practically limitless opportunities to explore and discover new things to stumble upon. Something that few people have ever seen before. Absolutely fascinated. You can never keep me inside as a kid. I would be out about trying to find new sights to see or trees to climb. The world was my jungle gym. I spent much of my youth in the Scouts, volunteering every summer I could at camp. Let's just say it did not shock anybody when I ended up as a park ranger after graduating college. My first job was in a park that was somewhat small and did not have many employees on top of its piss-poor management. I found myself taking on all sorts of jobs throughout my time there. My tasks had their ups and downs, but none of them ever compared to the experience I had while patrolling a section of the reserve's forestry. I understand this is going to sound a bit dramatic. Perhaps it is. But that week was a turning point in how I approached my life in general. Up until then, I had an upbeat, optimistic guy, always trying to see the best in others kind of look. A very strong love for people, animals, and the planet we resided on. I mean, I still do to a degree, but I definitely approached my sentiment a far more naive manner in the past. While I was patrolling in the forest that day, a smell of smoke breezed past my nostrils. Turning my head in that direction, continuously catching whiffs as I followed where it was coming from. There, I found a small fire pit made up of boulders, probably no more than 3 feet in diameter. The fire inside seemed as if it had been out for some time, so I knew the chances of me catching the person who built it were slim. That was a bit frustrating. Visitors were absolutely not allowed to start fires, except in designated areas during certain times of the year, for very good reason. In the past, I would catch teenagers with all sorts of things, but few items ever presented a legitimate danger to the park. So, of course, the one time I stumbled upon something that I did, I had no indication of who was responsible. Not knowing what else to do, I dismantled the fire pit in hopes to discourage its creator from making one again, should they ever pass through the area once more. The rest of the day was pretty boring, and if I was being honest, I always took the time to appreciate the nature around me. But that didn't mean it was particularly exciting. I returned to work the next day, already having forgotten about the fire pit situation from the previous night. I had already let the other staff and my superiors know about it, but like me, they mostly just shrugged their shoulders and said to let them know had I found out anything else. And as it turned out later on in the day, I did. It wasn't anything inherently dangerous. However, it did feel far more threatening than the fire pit. I wound up spotting a grimy old stuffed animal of a deer, a string wrapped around its neck as it was suspended from a tree branch. Something about that chilled me far more than if the figure were something like a human doll. I mean, I guess if that were the case, it would feel too obvious, like somebody was trying too hard to spook people. Why would somebody choose a toy deer out of all the things to suspend from a tree was beyond me. I checked out the area a bit more, made out yet another fire pit. I wasn't too far away from the area where I had found the one from the previous day, so I was certain I would have stumbled upon it already. I began to wonder if the perpetrator returned after I left the site and reconstructed their fire pit. I took a deep breath, rolling my eyes, talking into my walkie-talkie about the second pit I had found, and then went over to deconstruct it, just to be sure I was not going insane. I left the site and did not return until later in the evening. Nothing was there. Satisfied with my work, I went home for the day. I had the next day off, but requested my coworkers to keep me thoroughly in the loop about whether or not they'd seen any new fire pits emerging. I didn't get any news. I was patrolling a different area of the park that day, and of course, once more, stumbled upon a fire pit. However, this time, it did not have any wood actually in it. It was just a circle of rocks. I reported it nonetheless. And it wasn't long before I heard my boss over the walkie-talkie to telling me to quit being so paranoid. I sighed, simply kicking the structure apart. I despised this game of cat and mouse. When I went on my lunch break, I decided to head back to one of the buildings and get some snacks out of a vending machine. I would ask the other staff if the night patrol had noticed anything strange. That's when I learned that the night patrol did not actually do anything, mostly just dicked around. When I asked if they were the ones responsible for building the fire pits, they told me no. I also brought up stuff about the hung deer, which was just met with responses of laughs. Nobody really seemed to care or be bothered by what was going on. I was the odd one out. Even though I wasn't getting paid to stay past my shift, I wanted to get to the bottom of this. I decided to stick around where night came. Instead of just going home late, I would sleep in my car if need be. After all, young curious me was determined to figure out to catch the person who was building these fire pits. I didn't tell anybody I was staying. Out of fear, they'd give me a hard time or make me go home. I turned off my only walkie-talkie and stuck around the area where I had found the most recent fire pit. After a few minutes, I heard the sound of people talking and pacing around. It was not long before a flashlight came into view, and I could make out two men walking around in what appeared to be gray cloaks, holding bags that seemed to be stuffed to the brim. I was perplexed, as anyone would be. One of them grumbled about how that guy kept kicking down their fire pits, and I watched as they built it once more. I was so curious and fascinated. I had completely forgotten to even try to put a stop to their antics. I was armed, so I wasn't in any danger, but I had no idea what these guys could be carrying. One of them opened his bag. There were just a bunch of sticks, and the other lit the fire. Then I watched them walk around as they seemed to light up more fire pits until the entire area made one big ring of flame. There were a few calls, and a third cloaked man came out with a ladder. The second bag was opened. From what I could indicate, there was just a bunch of stuffed animals inside. I watched as they stringed up the animals onto the trees, before going to the center of the ring and lighting up what appeared to be a candle. One of them made a comment about how it needed to be quick, to which the other argued that their process cannot be rushed. I had no clue what was going on. Looking back, I still don't understand what their goal was. They all faced each other. Then, two more men came out and joined them. They all sat cross-legged and let out these low, melodic hums. By now, I came to the assumption this had to have been some sort of cult ritual. I was split on whether or not to intervene. I mean, I had no idea whether this was a nightly thing or seemed only planned. And if that was the case, I knew I would rather leave them alone, let them finish up and leave, so they wouldn't be a problem anymore. Another part of me knew it was also my responsibility to keep this park safe. Even past my shift, I was still on site. I admit, I didn't know what inherent danger these men possessed, besides the fire, which was still not allowed. It did seem to be well controlled, though. For the most part, these guys just really creeped me out. I could have approached them, but at the same time, like I said, I have no idea what kinds of weaponry they could have had concealed under their cloaks. I decided to just head back, before turning my walkie-talkie back on and informing the rest of the staff what I had just uncovered. They were mostly just confused about both what I was describing and why I was still around past my shift. I explained that I stayed in order to see what was going on, and at this point was fed up with nobody doing their job. So I let them have it, cussed them out quite a bit. They told me they would come up and help, but 20 minutes passes with no sign of anybody. That's when I decided to go back and confront my coworkers face to face. They were, of course, drunk and did not particularly believe me. I had to drag them out to my car and haul them to the place. However, by the time my headlights shone in that area, it was completely dark. We get out of the car, I take out my flashlight, and the stuffed animals were still hanging in the tree, and the fire pits were no longer burning, but emitted smoke. The sight seemed to make my coworkers sober up pretty quickly. We investigated the area a bit more. When we couldn't find these men, we sent out some people to look for them. We had come across several corpses of animals, like deer, coyotes, raccoons, all with ropes tied around their neck. We cut it off before leaving the animals to rest, and quickly dismantle the site of the ritual. There wasn't much else to do. There wasn't much else we could do. The search ultimately turned up nothing, and the fire pits stopped being built. No more stuffed animals. Like I said, this whole event shifted my mindset. While I still love the outdoors and exploring it, and discovering things it offered, it was also a great venue to conceal darker parts of the world. I suppose I just tread the world a little more carefully now. I've become a bit pessimistic in regards to my career. It has been a long time since I have worked at that park, and granted, I've stumbled across plenty of those close calls in the wild since. Confrontations with grizzlies, for example. Still, none of them ever shook me like that event. And to this day, I still feel a bit creeped out when I come across a pile of rocks. Story 17. Voices. I've been a park ranger now for well over 30 years. At some point, they decided that they would take some of the workload off my feet. Let me do most of my work at the visitor center, which is just about a third of the way into the natural reserve. My body appreciates their consideration for the condition that I'm in, but my mental health does not. Keeping on the move and always on patrol was my way of coping with things. Working out at the visitor center gave me more time to think. That's not necessarily a healthy thing for me. Suffice to say that I'm divorced, and my kids do not want to talk to me, all while I'm facing my twilight years by myself. I'm not trying to draw attention to myself. Those will be necessary details in just a few seconds. They forced me to take coffee breaks if I had to go too hard for too long. So, I was taking one such coffee break on the outdoor wooden park benches, completely by myself. People don't come to the park to look around. Besides, the brochures of park information, the only thing the place has to offer is the same 4 or 5 fun facts about the forest posters that have been hanging up here for the last 25 years. We've all seen them. Nobody wants to see them again. I was yanked out of my thoughts when I heard a voice that I had not heard for over 15 years. I recognized it right away. It was the voice of my ex-wife, and she was calling my name. Just as my brain was trying to come up with a rational explanation as to why I was hearing her voice, I heard my daughter's voice come out to me also, except she didn't sound like the 43-year-old woman she had grown into. Instead, it was her 8 or 9-year-old voice. I was anchored to the park bench for a while, afraid to move, just in case I was having a heart attack, a stroke, or experiencing something else that would mess with my mind. Maybe a near-life or near-death experience. Perhaps it was a practical joke, but who could mimic those voices so well and know my name at the same time? I decided to try a more tactical approach. I would come towards the voices, but I wouldn't answer them. There were long pauses between each call, as if my wife and daughter were waiting for an answer. But then they would call out again, and it was in those moments that I would pick up on the direction that they were coming from. Unless my ears were lying to me, it sounded like they were coming from the woods that came right up against the physical building of the visitor center. I stepped through the trees as silently as possible, resting when there was silence and walking when I heard voices. I came to an opening in the trees that couldn't have been more than 14 feet in diameter. It was clustered by some low-growing shrubs. I stayed hidden as best as possible. It sounded like the voices were coming from a small clearing. I didn't see how that could be possible. If my wife and my daughter were there, they'd be visible, unless they were lying down in the wild shrubs. I stared for what felt like forever, but then a shape slowly rose out of the growth, and the first thing I notice are these two large black eyes. They were proportionate to its head, the same way the eyes of a fly are proportionate to its head. Everything about it was just a little too long. The neck, the shoulders, the arms. It didn't stand up to its full length, just high enough to get a good look around, before it opened its mouth and spoke with both the voice of my wife and voice of my daughter, calling out to me, asking where I was and what was taking me so long. Then it sank back down into the brush. I could see its pale ribbed back bent over underneath the topmost leaves of the shrubbery. That's where it did its best to stay hidden. I pulled out my service pistol, and I shot as many times as I could before this thing realized there was a problem with its plan. At least 2 good hits bloomed black on its pale flesh before I sprang up and ran. I don't know if the other 3 or 4 shots hit or not. Miraculously, I was able to slip back to the visitor center and not have to offer an explanation to anybody. The older gal that works behind the front desk asked if she had heard something. I just told her I saw some kids setting off fireworks. My ex-wife may be many things, but somebody with the ability, let alone the intelligence, to send some strange, forest monster after me and lure me out with the sound of her voice isn't one of them. After this incident, I've kind of given into the urging of my superiors to spend more time in the visitor center, less time tromping around. There are clearly forces at work in this world that know more about me than I know about them, and the less I have to tangle with them, the better. Story 18. Disturbing. I don't know if anybody's going to believe me, but there's only one way to find out. When you see the small town that I live in, you wonder why they even bother setting aside funds for a patrol of the parks. You know, I guess you just never know when the trouble is going to come find the outside world in this little quiet place. Something that happened very recently has made me question whether trouble always comes from the outside. Our parks are small, but they are just big enough to have a couple of walking trails. If a day is feeling especially slow, I'll take the time to walk these trails, just for the hell of it. On paper, that means that I'm absolutely sure that there is no trouble whatsoever. So, one day, I'm walking the trail, and I get a real strong whiff of something good and dead. Not unlike the smell that might come from under your front porch when a squirrel or something else crawled away to die. But this was a strong, putrid odor. Something enough to make me question the size of the carcass. Once I could tell which direction the wind was coming from, I began to follow the smell. It led me off trail and into a thick of trees. The more crowded the trees got, the worse the smell became. This brought me into a very small clearing that I didn't even know existed. Here, I discovered scraps of sheet metal cobbled together into something like a shrine, complete with a peaked, corrugated roof. Small scraps were arranged into an altar. Behind it was a corpse that was set upright by a virtue of railroad spikes, driven through the chest and shoulders, pinning it to a large wooden crate. The legs were posed cross-legged. The head had been removed and replaced with a skull of buck with large antlers. Pink even still stained the skull, telling me that both the head and the corpse were about as fresh. Loud flies even filled the air. I don't know what to phone any of this in, as if it couldn't get any stranger. I saw something under the skull, lodged in the neck. There were papers, rolled up and weighed down by the skull. I phoned the whole thing in, waiting for dispatch, but nobody ever came in. I raised a holler over it, but everybody I mentioned it to just looked at me, like they didn't know what I was talking about, or they just didn't care. I called the paper to tell them about what I had found, but as soon as I told them which park, they hung up on me. Nobody around here is listening, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't think I can do anything about it. Story 19. The Note. The park that I service gets virtually little to no traffic. Part of that is because of how small the town is. Another part of that is today's Americans just don't get out for fresh air anymore. It's kind of sad, really. I see the video games people play today, a lot of them involving getting out into the wild, enjoying the fresh air and hunting and surviving. And people are literally paying money for a simulation of things they could do if they just go and get out of the house. And yet, even as little traffic as our park gets, I still find just enough litter to make me irritated. As if people get out into nature just long enough to ruin it for everyone else. I was cleaning up some fast food wrappers off of a park bench when, among the trees, I noticed something a little different. There was one of those corn husk dolls. The old kind. They are fashioned after the type that Native Americans used to make. It didn't have a face, just a blank knob for a head, and 4 nubs for arms and legs. Kind of cute in a creepy way, I thought to myself, until I noticed a small piece of paper rolled up and tucked into one of its folds. I unrolled it, and it just said, "Hello there." I smirked myself, decided that I had found some garbage that was worth keeping. After I was done picking up all the trash around the area, I went back to my patrol car, where there was another corn doll stuck behind the handle of the door. It too had another message. It read, "I said hello." My skin prickled and I looked around. As far as I could tell, I was the only person in the park. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, but then again, I was very absorbed in my work when I was picking up the garbage. Perhaps someone was watching me, so they could have snuck in and put this on the door without me noticing. Still, I didn't like to think that somebody got me like that. I got inside my car, shut the door, and no sooner had I done that, I noticed yet a third doll sitting on the steering wheel. Yes, it had another note. It said, "Could you use a hand?" I nearly soiled myself when something smacked into the windshield. It took a second to register that it was indeed a severed arm and a hand cut off at the elbow. Blood splattering on the glass, slowly running down in streaks. Worse yet, it was a smaller hand. I immediately radioed out that we had a psychopath on the loose. The response came fairly quickly, but I wasn't sure if it was soon enough to keep up with whoever was inside the park. I didn't have much time, so I brought everybody up to speed, and there was a thorough sweeping of the park. They didn't find anything. No killer, no body, no evidence. Forensics did tests on the severed arm, found out that it did indeed belong to a child that had been missing for over 2 months. The arm that hit my windshield was relatively fresh, so that meant the kid was still alive when this happened. The rest of the day kind of just went by in a haze. I felt like a failure for not catching that monster, and all the moments that I could have when he was tampering with my car. My day ended on an ominous tone when I came home and there was one of those same corn dolls stuck behind the doorknob of my home. And guess what? It had a note. Let's play again soon. If you or someone you know has a story they would like me to read or share with me, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. I would love to read it. I was a park ranger for over 20 years. It never ceased to amaze me just how many people would tell me about my encounters they had with the paranormal, all while camping or hiking in our very public lands. Since I've retired, I've also heard from friends and acquaintances alike that are park rangers all across the country. Stories of bizarre creatures that were disturbing and equally distressing to see. I suppose I was always logical and even scientifically minded through these perhaps crazy sightings, but you never know. Many of these people that have seen these things were always dubbed insane, lunatics, or even as they say today, imbalanced. But there's always one story that has stuck with me, because somebody died. A father and his daughter were out for a walk in the woods. Now, where they're walking is a little pond where ducks will congregate, and this local man decided to take his 5-year-old daughter down to see the pond and the ducks. The man later explained to me that as he was feeding the ducks with his daughter, he heard yelling in the trees, another person, screaming as if they were being attacked. He looked around frantically, trying to identify who or what it was that was causing all the commotion. He told me that he decided to run into the trees, following the sound, and he came across a dead body. A man who had been savagely killed was covered in blood. It was a terrible sight, and he told me he is so glad he didn't bring his daughter in with him. She stood beside the pond, forbidden to walk anywhere. The man said the killer was nowhere to be found, as he was looking for a human. But he did see some wolf-like creatures on the fringes of the woods, looking at him from the trees with red eyes. He left the dead man, went and got his daughter, and ran to safety. He was deeply distressed and agitated when he told me the story. I never forgot that story. It stayed with me all these years later, because it was real, and somebody actually died. Somebody that lost their lives at the hands of something deep in the woods. Something unknown but dangerous and violent. I've been a ranger for many years now. I've had countless encounters with the paranormal and strange creatures of all kinds while doing my daily rounds. As for this job, it's pretty normal to experience unexplainable things from time to time, though most people would normally just shrug off those events as being their imagination or overreactive nerves. One particular time, we had a report that there was a fire in the woods and smoke was seen rising. We took a walk out, myself and my colleague, expecting to come across some college kids or high school kids who, of course, had been drinking, maybe just started a fire as a prank. When we walked out, we realized we couldn't even smell smoke, which was odd. We also didn't hear any of the usual sounds that kids would make. No loud noises, no screams or laughing. Just pure silence, deep in the woods. It was incredibly unnerving. We kept walking nonetheless, and had the exact same spot on the map. When we got there, it was just a small grassy area that had the markings of a tent, but no such tent was there. It was empty. Smoke and fire surrounded by looming dark trees. My colleague was a great hulking man, and so even I was taken aback when he screamed. He grabs onto my shoulder like a baby, almost pulling me to the ground. He kept pointing into the woods, and when I turned to see, I nearly died. It seemed to be some sort of apparition, in the shape of a human, but white, pure white, like white skin. No discernible features like a face or hair or nose or ears. Just a blank face with green like slits for eyes. It also had white skin from head to toe and was white as a sheet. This apparition stood staring at us for what felt like an eternity. Although it was probably only like 10 or 20 seconds. It eventually seemed to disappear, not even walk away or fade, but just disappear in a flash. We eventually recovered and got out to feet. And boy, if anyone had seen us, two grown tough men in our ranger uniforms, on the floor sobbing like women. But we both felt like we had seen something beyond this world. Beyond any world. Almost an extraterrestrial. To this day, I have no idea what it was that I saw. But thankfully, never saw it again. My colleague retired after the incident and never kept in contact. I think he was so highly distressed what had happened, he couldn't cope with being anywhere near the forest. I hope one day I find answers as to what this creature was. It would give me a definitive peace of mind. I'm a new park ranger here at Silver Lake State Park, right in the middle of Tennessee. I've been here for 2 weeks, and I love it. This is the first time in my life that I have lived someplace other than New York City. It's beautiful here, with all of its hills and mountains, trees and nature surrounding. I feel so blessed to have this job, wake up to this explosion of nature. However, there have been 1 or 2 incidents in this job I can't quite explain. One day, I was in my cabin, doing a quick check of the surrounding areas on my binoculars, and I was going from right to left to right, scanning for anything unusual. I stopped when I saw something large and brown in the distance. It looked completely bizarre. It was roughly around 6 to 8 feet tall, in the shape and form of a man, but completely covered in brown hair, with little patches of white. It seemed to be a man dressed like a dog, but this couldn't be. The face was completely dog-like, and it had the face of a wolf. I felt sick to my stomach, wondering, had somebody drugged me? Or maybe I was sleep-deprived. I watched this thing from my binoculars when it looked up, staring right at me, cold in the eye. Immediately, I fell back off my chair onto the floor, spilling my coffee everywhere. The next thing, my manager came in, asked had I been drinking. Now, I debated internally about whether I should tell him or not, but I decided to reveal all. When I told him, he simply just rubbed his chin, looked serious. He walked to the window and looked out into the vast expanse of forest and land. There's something out there that scares me. What it is, I don't have a clue. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I took it to mean he has encountered this thing before, or at least heard reports of its existence. I wasn't completely crazy. I'm pretty sure that I've seen this creature a few weeks ago, but it disappeared quickly, as if to escape from my stare. Look, it is yet to take away the love for this job. If anything, I would like to know more what's out there, and if it wants to be discovered. I mean, sure, when rangers discovered bears for the first time, there was fear. Maybe I have discovered some new species, but a part of me feels I've encountered something terrible, something dark that has power to do terrible things. Skinwalkers are shapeshifters. They can turn into any animal that they want to, which is why it is so hard to believe in them. The main idea of this creature is to be they feared for what they may or may not do. Little is known about these creatures, but many stories are told around the Southwest states. One particular incident was told to me by my own great-grandmother. It was in fact an experience she had when she was 11 or 12. This would have been in the early 1930s. She said that she was in the Great Depression, as you would imagine, very depressing. She was helping her father on the farm, lifting bales of hay, helping to feed the cattle. She said that her feet had blisters, and her hands had sores from all the physical labor. If only kids today knew. She told me that it was around 4 p.m. in the summer. Her father was back inside, getting ready for dinner. She was still outside. She told me that she was pretty pissed off that all her brothers had gone back in. That's when she explained that something strange happened. The sun began getting really small in the sky, and bigger, and eventually disappearing behind the clouds. This left the sky very gray, and she began to fear for herself. The next thing she told me, that one of the cattle beside her began going crazy, running around and roaring, greatly agitated. It scared the heck out of her, she told me. She had no experience in calming animals, and the next thing, she said the cow ran behind some bush, then emerged as a sheep, but covered in blood, and with the face of a wolf. My great-grandmother told me she stood there, absolutely petrified, watching this sheep emerge. But not a sheep. Something else. Something dark and demonic. I remember. She broke down as she explained her story. My great-grandmother, the 90, were living such a trauma from many years before. It was deeply emotive and moving. It showed me that my trauma and pain never leaves memory. She explained that the sheep continued running around the field, scarring the cattle, maiming several of them. It looked totally crazed and bloodthirsty, and the next thing she told me was that her own father came out with the family shotgun and attempted to shoot the sheep, but it disappeared behind the bushes, never coming out. When they checked the bushes, nothing was there except some dried blood and wool. My great-grandmother said her own father moved the entire family after the incident, and, of course, regularly used blessed salt and holy water all over the farm. My great-grandmother was very into supernatural and paranormal events. She did a great deal of research on the incident, and is very convinced she saw a shapeshifter. I mean, it would make a lot of sense, as many of the characteristics of shapeshifters are fulfilled in my great-grandmother's description of the beast. I'm just sorry she is gone now. To have lived with such a traumatic memory, it must have been tough. This story, of course, has completely fascinated me, from a child to the age of 35, today. I feel compelled to put pen to paper, so they say, and share this recollection of my great-grandmother's tale with as many as possible. I mean, I feel I owe it to her. No child deserved to see such horror that is what my great-grandmother saw. So, if you are reading this, please tell me something about them. Have they always existed? How do we get rid of them? What do they do? What are they capable of? Are they all evil? I mean, are there good shapeshifters? I have so many questions, but I am committed to researching this, and hope you will bring me many answers, if not for me, for my great-grandmother. Thank you for reading.